Every day I tried to be a good husband. Vicky and I shared chores around the house, tried to support each other when needed, or at least I thought we did. We both worked, and it was important to our mutual well-being. I wanted the children to grow up in good conditions, to have everything they needed. Our home was a symbol of what we had accomplished together, the result of our efforts. I remember when we were looking for this house. Vicky was thrilled with every step of the process. We traveled through dozens of options before we found one that suited us both. The first years of marriage were full of joy. The birth of our children was a special moment for us, and I felt our family was growing stronger every day. Vicky became a mother that could only be admired, caring, attentive, always on top of everything our children needed. She was a true keeper of the home, and I was proud of her. But then, as it happens in life, things started to change. At first, it was little things, small, subtle changes in her behavior. She started spending more time out of the house, explaining it was because of work or seeing her friends. I believed her. Honestly, I had no reason to doubt her word. I had never been jealous or suspicious. Even when she came home late, I just told myself that it was all part of life, and we both deserved our own personal space. However, as these evenings became more frequent, I began to sense something amiss. Vicky stopped sharing her thoughts and plans with me. Our conversations were reduced to mundane matters: how the day went, what we needed to buy at the store, what activities awaited the children next week. I felt that the emotional closeness that used to exist between us was fading. But even then, I tried not to dramatize the situation. We had kids, work, lots of worries. There isn't always time for deep conversations, I reminded myself. There was one night when I felt the gap particularly acutely. We were sitting in the kitchen after dinner. Vicky seemed immersed in her own thoughts, though she usually talked about her work or weekend plans. I asked her what was wrong, but she replied succinctly, "Nothing's wrong, just tired." This answer didn't satisfy me, but I didn't insist. Instead, I tried to distract her, suggested spending the weekend with the kids in nature, a break from the hustle and bustle of the city. But Vicky nodded indifferently, offering no ideas. A few more months passed, and I began to notice that she hardly ever smiled. We rarely touched each other, as if an invisible wall had been erected between us. In the evenings, when we went to bed, she often turned her back to the wall, and when I tried to talk to her or show her affection, she responded with a cold tone that irritated me more and more. It was hard for me to understand what was going on, and even harder to accept it. This was not the marriage I had envisioned. Everything looked normal on the outside, but on the inside, alienation was growing. One Friday night, when the kids were already asleep, I decided to discuss it with her directly. I felt I could no longer ignore the problem. We were sitting in the living room, and I, not knowing where to start, just exhaled. "Vicky, we need to talk." She looked at me over the phone screen, and there was no surprise or alarm in her gaze. Rather, it was the look of someone who knew in advance what the conversation was going to be about. "About what?" she asked dryly, setting the phone down on the table. "About us. I feel like something's wrong and I can't figure out what it is. We're barely talking. You've pulled away. You come home late, and when you're here, it's like you're gone. It's been going on for a long time. What's going on?" She sighed and answered with an indifference that stunned me. "Derek, you're exaggerating. I'm fine. It's just that I'm busy at work and sometimes at home you want quiet. Isn't that normal?" I was silent, trying to find something in her words that could calm me down, but I found nothing. I was so agitated I couldn't stop. "Vicky, it's not just fatigue. I feel like you're not here anymore, not with me. You're always rushing off somewhere, and when you're home, it's like you don't exist. I'm not asking for much. I just want to understand what's going on." Her face remained impenetrable. She felt no regret or guilt. Her words were so cold that I felt like she was talking to a stranger. "Derek, I think you're making a big deal out of this. I'm tired. We have kids, work, a lot of responsibilities. I need time to myself, and I don't want to discuss our relationship every night. We're both adults, and we have our own lives. You could relax a little, too." Her tone and facial expression pierced me like an icy knife. In that moment, I realized that she wasn't experiencing what I was experiencing. I was filled with anxiety, and she was completely calm. Her indifference hurt me more than any words could. I wanted to ask her 1,000 more questions, but I couldn't. She just didn't give me any emotional foothold I could grab onto. I lay awake for a long time that night, thinking about our conversation. It felt like everything we had built over the years was starting to crumble, and I didn't know how to stop it. I was plagued by a feeling of helplessness, like I was drowning in my own home, surrounded by people I loved but could no longer reach. But I still had hope. I told myself that these were just temporary hardships, that marriage is a job, and sometimes you have to get through the hard times. But each new day brought more and more evidence that I was deluded. A few weeks after that conversation, I noticed another strange change in Vicky's behavior. She started paying more attention to her appearance. She bought new clothes, started wearing makeup, and going to the salon more often. Of course, it could just be a desire to look good, but something about it alarmed me. She was leaving more and more often in the evenings and coming back late, often avoiding conversation. I tried not to think the worst, but doubts began to gnaw at me from the inside. After those months of uncertainty and coldness, my relationship with Vicky became unbearable. The children, Thomas and Oliver, stayed out of our problems. I always made sure they didn't see the tension between us, even as Vicky and I talked less and less. Thomas was 8, and Oliver was 5, and they couldn't yet fully understand what was going on. I loved them more than anything, and knew they deserved a complete family, but it seemed like ours was crumbling right before their eyes. The boys were still the joy of my life. We spent weekends together, playing ball in the yard, or going fishing when we had the chance. But more and more often now, I noticed Thomas looking at me anxiously when Vicky came home late or when we argued. He didn't ask questions, but his eyes said it all. He sensed something bad was going on between us. One evening, when Vicky left again for a work meeting, Thomas came up to me in the kitchen. He sat down at the table, holding his toy car, and quietly asked, "Daddy, doesn't Mommy love us anymore?" That question pierced me like a sharp knife. I looked at him, trying to find words that would reassure him, but everything inside me was boiling with pain. How do you explain to a child what you don't fully understand? "No, Thomas," I said, pulling on a smile. "Mom loves us. She just has a lot of work to do right now. You know she's always looking out for you and Oliver." He nodded, but there was no confidence in his eyes. He sensed something was wrong, but I couldn't give him the explanation he was waiting for. Oliver, being younger, didn't ask such questions. It was enough for him that his mom was home sometimes to play with him or put him to bed. But I knew the kids could sense our tension, even if we tried to hide it from them. A couple weeks after that conversation with Thomas, my suspicions about Vicky became even more obvious. I couldn't get her constant work meetings out of my mind, her coldness and lack of interest in our family. I tried to distract myself with work and childcare, but it all came back to the same thing. Something was wrong, and I had to find out what it was. One night, when she again said she would be late for work, I made a decision I never would have thought of before. I decided to follow her. I didn't want to do it, but something inside me wouldn't let go. I had to know the truth, no matter how dire the consequences. I left the kids with my neighbor, saying I had important business to attend to, and went to pick up Vicky. She was indeed headed for the office building, and I began to doubt my suspicions. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe she really was at work, and all my fears were the result of accumulated anxiety and mistrust? But an hour later, she didn't leave the building alone. At first, I couldn't believe my eyes. Next to her was a man I had never seen before. They were walking together toward his car, and everything in their demeanor, laughter, light touching, indicated that this was not a business meeting. My heart pounded in a frantic rhythm. I tried to keep my distance so they wouldn't notice me, but I followed them without taking my eyes off them. They hadn't gone to a restaurant or a cafe, but to a small hotel outside the city. I knew the place. Couples often went there to spend time away from prying eyes. I sat in the car and watched them go inside, and in that moment my whole world came crashing down. Everything I had tried to ignore and justify was confirmed with startling clarity. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't know what to do. My head was buzzing with 1,000 thoughts, but none of them could calm this adrenaline rush. I sat in the car, watching the hotel entrance, unable to move. It was as if time had stopped. 2 hours later, they came out, and Vicky looked like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. She was holding his hand again, her face glowing with a calmness and confidence I hadn't seen in her home in months. I couldn't believe that this woman was the mother of my children, my wife, the one I had spent almost 10 years with. I felt like I was looking at a completely different person in front of me. When Vicky came home that night, I already knew that our relationship was at an end. But despite everything I had seen, I had a hard time admitting it to myself definitively. The thought was still bouncing around in my head that maybe it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, that things could be fixed if I talked to her. I waited for her in the living room. She walked in, not expecting anything unusual, and didn't even notice that I was awake. "Where have you been?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. She looked at me, and her expression didn't change one bit. "I told you I had a meeting," she answered as calmly as ever. "And that meeting ended at the hotel?" Her face froze for a moment, but then she shrugged as if it were an insignificant moment. "Yes," she answered, with the same icy calm. "What do you want to hear?" "I was with him. And now what?" I couldn't believe my ears. Instead of trying to explain herself, or at least admit her guilt, she spoke as if it were an everyday occurrence. I stared at her, trying to find some emotion in her face, but her eyes were as cold as her words. We're a family, Vicky. We have kids. You're not even trying to save our marriage?" I was desperate. "Family?" she grinned. "Do you really still believe we have a family? Our marriage died a long time ago, Derek. You just don't want to admit it. I'm tired of it. I'm fine with him, and that's all I care about right now." Her words pierced me to the core. Vicky talked about me and our children with such indifference, as if we had never been a part of her life. How could she look so calmly at the destruction of what we had spent years building? I tried to remind her about the kids, about Thomas and Oliver, but she just sighed. "The kids, I'll make sure they see me. I'm not going to disappear from their lives, but I don't want to be part of this illusion of marriage anymore." That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed her words over and over in my head, trying to figure out when it all went wrong. I couldn't imagine life without Vicky, but even more, I couldn't imagine telling my children that their family no longer existed. As I began to realize that my relationship with Vicky and I was rapidly going downhill, I felt completely helpless. My whole life up to that point had seemed predictable and stable. Family, kids, job. But ever since the truth of her cheating had come to light, it was as if I'd lost the footing under my feet. I can't say I was ready for it. I guess no one is ready for betrayal from someone they loved and considered their life. All this time, I tried to continue to live my life as I had before. I took care of the kids, went to work, talked to my coworkers, but thoughts of Vicky and her betrayal never left me for a second. The question kept running through my mind. How could she do that? Why did she choose him over me? We were a family. We had Thomas and Oliver. Didn't that mean anything to her? I often tossed and turned at night, and when I did fall asleep, I had nightmares I saw her with that man again and again, as if it were a curse that kept me awake. I couldn't get rid of the image of them walking into the hotel together. Her smile, her calm gaze that I hadn't seen at home in so long. It was destroying me from the inside out. I'd wake up in a cold sweat. My heart was racing, and I could barely contain the urge to run out of the house, to go somewhere far away so I wouldn't have to see this empty, cold life. But I couldn't just leave. I had children. Thomas and Oliver, my boys, who deserved a better life than one where their parents barely spoke to each other. And I knew I couldn't let myself give up. At least not until I did everything I could to save our family. I thought about the fact that maybe Vicky could still be brought back. Maybe she was just confused. Maybe this whole thing was a mistake that could be fixed. At some point, I decided that I needed to talk to her honestly, not just about what happened, but about what we could do to make things right. I wanted the Vicky I loved back, the woman who'd been there for me all these years. I couldn't let her go that easily. One evening, when the kids had already gone to bed, I decided to have this conversation. Vicky was sitting on the couch with her phone in her hands, immersed in her thoughts as usual. I sat down next to her and felt my insides tighten with tension. "Vicky," I began, struggling to find the words. "We need to talk." She didn't immediately take her eyes off the screen, but when she saw that I was serious, she finally looked at me. About what? Her voice was cold, as it had always been lately. About us, about our family, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, even though I was seething inside. I can't go on like this. We have to do something to make things right. Her face remained impenetrable. It was like she was expecting something like this, but her indifference gave me no chance to feel like she cared. Derek, she began, sighing. Don't you understand? There's no fixing this. I don't feel for you the way I used to. I tried, but it's gone. Her words hit me like a hammer blow to the head. I stared at her for a long time, trying to figure out if I was wrong, if this was a dream. But this was reality, and it was relentless. I expected some emotional reaction, even a hint of regret, but her voice remained cold and detached. But we have a family, children, I said, trying to appeal to what must have been important to her. The kids will stay with us, Derek. We won't stop being their parents, but I can't pretend our marriage means anything anymore. I know it's hard for you, but for me, this marriage has been over for a long time. Her words pierced through me to pieces. I knew she was right that our marriage had been on the rocks for a long time, but I still believed that something could be fixed. I was willing to forgive her cheating if she would at least try to explain herself, if she would say it was a mistake, that she was sorry. But none of that happened. She didn't feel the least bit guilty. I'm willing to forgive everything, I breathed out, feeling my voice shake. We can start over, for the sake of the kids, for the sake of our family. She looked at me, and all I could see in her eyes was tiredness. I don't want this anymore, Derek. I don't see the point in continuing. It hurt me to hear that. How could it? How could you just let go so easily of all the years we'd been together? I was ready to fight for us, but Vicky had already made up her mind. Her coldness was unbearable. So it was all for nothing? I asked, feeling tears coming to my throat. Everything we'd built, all these years, it meant nothing to you? It meant something once, she said, getting up from the couch as if this conversation was finally over for her. But things have changed now. You have to accept that. She left for the bedroom, leaving me alone on the couch. My heart was breaking with pain. I couldn't believe that she was letting things go so easily, that our past no longer mattered to her. I sat there in silence, trying to realize what had happened. In that moment, I realized that Vicky wasn't coming back to me. She had chosen a different life, and I was no part of it. The next morning, I felt devastated. I knew that my attempt to rebuild my family had failed, but I couldn't give up so easily. Over the next few days, I tried to find other ways to win her back. I suggested spending more time with the kids, taking a trip together, if only for a weekend. I tried to establish some kind of connection between us, but her response was always the same: cold indifference. Meanwhile, the children were beginning to feel the change too. Thomas became even more withdrawn. He hardly ever talked to me about Vicky, but I knew he could guess that something was wrong. Oliver was too young to fully understand what was going on, but he too was noticing that Mom was no longer home as often as she used to be. One evening, Thomas came up to me as I was sitting in the kitchen. Daddy, is Mommy going to leave us? He asked quietly, looking at me with his big, worried eyes. The question literally stopped my breath. I didn't know how to answer. After all, I was afraid of it myself. Vicky seemed to have already left us emotionally, and I didn't know how much longer she would still be around physically. No, son, Mommy will always be there for you, I said, trying to reassure him. We'll always be a family, no matter how hard things get. He nodded, but I could see that it didn't reassure him. Thomas was too smart for his age, and he already understood more than I was willing to explain to him. A few more weeks passed, and I realized that I could no longer continue this fight alone. Vicky had become so distant that I couldn't reach her. She had left our family before she even filed the divorce papers. Though I still clung to the hope that something could be fixed, inside I began to realize that our family would never be the same again. After my attempts to repair my relationship with Vicky had failed, I found myself in limbo. I felt like life no longer had the same meaning it had before, and everything that had once seemed so important began to lose importance. Nevertheless, I couldn't allow myself to sink completely into despair. I had children, and they still needed me, even if I could no longer be a full part of their family life with Vicky. My boys, Thomas and Oliver, were still the only thing that kept me connected to reality. For their sake, I tried to hold on, but it was getting harder and harder. Ever since I realized that Vicky no longer had feelings for me, I began to wonder what I should do next. I was tormented by the thought that I had to do something else, to find a way to get her back. Every night, I mentally went through possible scenarios of conversations with her, trying to figure out how I could get through to her heart. I still hoped that somewhere inside, she'd retain a shadow of what had once bound us together. But every time we talked, I saw in front of me a person who had long ago made the decision to live without me. Vicky was no longer hiding her new life. She came and went as if it was the norm. She no longer pretended that her delays were work-related. Her indifference hurt the most. It was as if I was just a shadow of the past to her that didn't matter in her new reality. Thomas and Oliver saw her less and less at home, and though they didn't ask direct questions, I knew they were beginning to sense the change too. Once Vicky left again in the evening, I was alone with Thomas and Oliver. We were sitting in the living room watching a movie, but I noticed that Thomas was barely paying attention to the screen. He was too serious for his age, and it bothered me. Oliver fell asleep on the couch next to me, and Thomas continued to stare into the void in silence. Finally, he turned to me and asked quietly, "Daddy, why does Mommy leave so often?" The question hung in the air, and I froze for a moment, not knowing how to answer. I didn't want to lie to my son, but I didn't know how to explain to him everything that was going on between Vicky and me. How do I explain to a child that his mother no longer wanted to be a part of the family? How do I tell him that the woman he thought was perfect had betrayed us all? Mom has a lot on her plate, Thomas. I began carefully, trying not to go into too much detail. But that doesn't mean she doesn't love you. Sometimes adults have difficulties that children can't always understand. He looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that I couldn't understand. Maybe it was disappointment. Maybe it was fear. I didn't know what else to say, so I just hugged him, trying to give him some sense of security. But in the back of my mind, I knew there was nothing more I could do to bring back the family he knew. A few more weeks passed, and things were getting worse. Vicky was still rarely home, and when she was, there was a tense silence between us. We no longer talked about trying to repair the relationship. She seemed to have finally accepted that our marriage was over, and she didn't care. I, on the other hand, couldn't accept that reality so easily. Despite her indifference, I continued to cling to the hope that she would change her mind. I tried to show her that I still loved her, that I was willing to forgive everything if she would just give us a chance to start over. I did everything I could to create a semblance of normalcy for the kids, trying to spend more time with them, organizing weekend trips, playing in the yard, going to the movies. I wanted them to feel that despite everything, we were still a family. One day, in another attempt to talk to Vicky, I suggested we have a family dinner. This was a rarity lately. Vicky was hardly ever home in the evenings, and when she was, she preferred to spend her time alone or with her phone in her hands. But this time, she agreed, and I thought it might be a chance for something better. I made dinner, the kids were happy to spend time as a family, but Vicky seemed aloof. She hardly spoke at all, answering in one-word phrases, and I could see her thoughts hovering somewhere far away from us. After supper, when the children had gone to their rooms, I tried to talk to her again. "Vicky," I began, "I realize we're going through a difficult time, but you remember how things used to be, don't you? We were happy, we had a strong family. Maybe we can try to get that back. We can start over for the kids, for us." She looked at me, and there wasn't a hint of emotion in her gaze. "Derek, I told you before, it's impossible. You have to understand that. I don't want to live like this anymore. I have my own life, and I'm not going back to the way it was before." I was silent, not knowing what to say. There wasn't an ounce of doubt in her words, and it was killing me. I could feel everything crumbling inside of me. I was ready to forgive her cheating, ready to forget everything that had happened. If only she wanted to come back. But she didn't care. For her, our marriage was over long ago. "But the children," I squeezed out. feeling my voice shake. How can we do this to them? They understand. Thomas had already asked me if you'd leave them. Her face remained impenetrable. I would never abandon the children, Derek, but I can't live with you. You have to understand that. Those words finally shattered my hope. I realized there was nothing more I could do. Vicky had made her decision, and nothing I could do could change it. I was forced to admit defeat. We were no longer the family I had known her to be. Even so, I continued to live for the children. Every day I woke up thinking that they still needed me, that no matter how my life with Vicky turned out, I had to remain a support for them. Thomas and Oliver were too young to fully understand what was happening, but I could see that they were beginning to adjust to a new reality where Mom and Dad were no longer the same. Vicky was home less and less often, and I began to wonder what to do next. It was hard for me to watch her drift away from us, but I couldn't let her go completely. I was still trying to hold on to the memories that bound us together, the love that seemed to have vanished without a trace. But deep down, I knew it was over. The moment I feared most had arrived. Vicky was essentially no longer a part of our family, but her physical presence sometimes still reminded me that we had some remnant of what we had once built together. I clung to it, even though I realized it was only an illusion. But one day, when she came home late at night, something happened that I had avoided for so long. We sat in silence in the kitchen. I didn't even try to start a conversation, but the very sight of her face, calm, cold as always, stirred a storm of emotion inside me. It was like she was completely disconnected from our lives, and whatever I was doing no longer interested her. "Derek," she began, suddenly breaking the silence. "I wanted to talk." Her voice was unusually calm, as if she were about to discuss something mundane, like tomorrow's shopping list. But something in her tone made me wary. "About what?" I asked, trying to stay calm, though I could sense inside that this was going to be a difficult conversation. "I'm filing for divorce," she said bluntly, without the slightest hint of hesitation. My heart stopped for a moment. I felt my thoughts slow down, and then everything around me suddenly spun as if someone had punched me right in the solar plexus. "Divorce?" I barely spoke, looking her in the eye. She nodded, not looking away as if to confirm the obvious. I was still hoping to hear something that might give me a chance, some hint that it could be prevented, but her face remained as impassive as ever. "I don't see the point in going on with this anymore," she said, shrugging slightly, as if this wasn't about our lives, but about something insignificant. "I've been thinking about it for a long time. You and I aren't together anymore, and I want to move on." Her words hit me like hammers. I felt like I was losing ground under my feet. Divorce. That word seemed like something unbelievable, something I could never imagine, especially after everything we'd been through together. But she was serious, and it was obvious. "What about the kids?" I asked, finally gathering my thoughts. It was my last argument, my only chance to keep her. She nodded again, as if she'd been expecting that question. "I've already thought about it. I want the children to stay with me." The words made me freeze. Everything inside me was tingling with indignation. She wants to take the kids. After practically abandoning us, after betraying her family? I couldn't believe she was serious. "Are you serious?" I asked, feeling my voice start to shake with emotion. "You're hardly ever home. You've admitted yourself that our family isn't for you anymore. And you think the kids should stay with you?" Vicky sighed, as if I was saying obvious things that weren't even worth discussing. "I'm their mother, Derek. They should live with me. It's okay. I want them to stay safe and comfortable, and I can provide that for them." I couldn't believe my ears. How could anyone be so indifferent? She talked so easily about taking our children away as if it was just a matter of convenience. I felt an anger building up inside me that I could no longer contain. "You want to take the kids away after you destroyed our family? You think you can just walk away and then come back and take them away like nothing happened?" I was almost screaming, unable to control my emotions. "I am their father, and I'm not going to let you just take them away." She remained surprisingly calm. Her indifference only added fuel to the fire. "Derek, I'm not trying to hurt you," she said, as if my suffering didn't affect her. But you have to realize that this is the best decision for all of us. The kids will live with me, and you can see them whenever you want. We can make a deal." "Arrange?" I exclaimed. "What are you talking about, Vicky? Do you really think you can give them the life they deserve? You're hardly ever with them yourself. How are you going to be a mother to them?" She shrugged, as if it was a question that didn't really bother her. "I've got this, Derek. You have to realize it's not the end of the world. Everything can be worked out." It's her words that finally pissed me off. She makes it sound like it's a simple fix, like I have to accept that she's taking my kids away from me. "No, Vicky," I said firmly. "I'm not going to agree to this. I won't let you take them away. They'll stay with me. I've been with them all these years that you've been estranged. I was their rock, and you were somewhere else, living your life. And now you can't just come and get them." She looked at me with an impenetrable expression, as if considering my words. "I don't want to turn this into a war," she said finally, but her voice was cold. "But if you stand your ground, we'll have to settle this in court." Her words cut me to the core. A trial. Is she really willing to go through with this? Ready to fight for the children through the court as if they were a thing to be divided? I stood in front of her, feeling an ache inside me that I couldn't control. I never imagined our lives would come to this. "We can't just—" I started but stopped myself. All my attempts to mend the relationship, all the efforts I had made to keep the family together were in vain. Vicky was determined. She had chosen her path, and that path didn't include me. I realized that she was never coming back, and that there was no point in trying to get her back anymore. But I couldn't let her take Thomas and Oliver away. I knew they deserved more than just to be an object in a lawsuit. I had to fight for them, even if it meant a war I didn't want. When Vicky left that night, I was alone in the kitchen. My heart clenched with pain, with the realization that our marriage had come to an end, that our family was destroyed. But there was still determination inside me. I couldn't let her take our children. Thomas and Oliver were everything to me, and I knew I had to do everything I could to keep them with me. I didn't know how I was going to handle this. I didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. I wasn't giving up. Vicky did file for divorce a few days after our last conversation. I had expected it, but that moment when the papers came was still like a blow. I sat at the kitchen table that afternoon, holding the papers that once again confirmed that my life hadn't just changed. It had shattered. I stared at the sheets that talked about property division, schedules for seeing the kids, and all those legal minutiae that turn a family into a set of cold facts and responsibilities. But what hit me the hardest was that Vicky had actually insisted that the kids live with her. She wanted primary custody, and I was only left to see Thomas and Oliver on weekends and holidays. At that moment, a veritable hurricane of feelings boiled up inside me. How could she do this? How could she take the children away from the father who had been there for them all this time, raising them, spending every day with them? I couldn't let it happen. Of course, I knew that my relationship with Vicky was broken. I'd given up hope of ever getting her back. But the children were different. They shouldn't be victimized by her decisions. I was willing to fight for them to the last man. And if that required going to court, so be it. I started looking for an attorney who could help me with the case. The whole divorce process was something unfamiliar to me. I didn't know where to start, but I realized one thing. I couldn't lose. Vicky didn't seem to hesitate. She had her new life already laid out, and children were part of that plan for her. But I was willing to go all the way to the end to keep them with me. Every day I spent time with Thomas and Oliver, I felt like I was losing them. They had seen our family fall apart, and while I tried to do everything I could to make them feel safe, I realized that they were realizing a lot more than I would have liked. Thomas especially became more withdrawn. He didn't ask questions directly, but I knew he understood what was going on. Oliver, on the other hand, being younger, didn't fully realize the extent of the changes yet, but his mood had changed as well. He became more cranky, demanding more attention, and I knew it was his way of dealing with the chaos that had happened in our house. One night when I had put Oliver to bed, Thomas came up to me in the living room. He sat down on the couch and was silent for a long time, as if he was gathering his thoughts before he asked a question. Dad, Mom said we're going to live with her. He finally breathed out. It sounded like a thunderclap. I could feel this moment coming, but I wasn't ready for it. Vicky had already started talking to the kids about her plans without saying a word to me. Is this what you want? I asked quietly, trying not to show how hard it was for me to hear. Thomas paused for a moment, and then shrugged. I don't know, he said, lowering his head. Mom said it was best for everyone. That you agreed too. I froze. Vicky hadn't just decided to take the kids. She'd already started influencing them, convincing them that I agreed with her decision. In that moment, I realized that the fight was not just in court, but for the minds and hearts of my sons. Thomas, I said, leaning closer to him, I never agreed to this. I don't want you and Oliver to live apart from me. We are a family, and I can't imagine my life without you by my side every day. Thomas looked up at me, and I could see the confusion in his eyes. But Mom said, I know what Mom said, I interrupted him, trying to speak calmly. But you have to know that I want you to be with me. I can't make the decision for you, but I want you to know that I will always be there for you, no matter what the circumstances. Thomas was silent for a long moment, then nodded quietly and went to his room. I didn't know if he fully understood everything I was trying to convey, but this conversation showed me that Vicky had already started her plan. She wanted to take the children and make it as painless as possible for herself by convincing them that it was a natural decision. A few days later, our legal battle began. I met with my attorney and we discussed strategy. I wanted full custody, but realized that the courts rarely side with one parent unless there was a good reason to do so. My job was to show that the children needed their father's constant presence and that Vicky, for all her indifference to our family, would not be able to give them enough time and attention. My attorney was confident that I had a good chance, but warned that the process could be long and exhausting. We began gathering evidence that I had always been an active participant in our children's lives, that I was involved in their upbringing and was with them every step of the way while Vicky became increasingly distant. The very anticipation of the trial was agonizing. I continued to take care of Thomas and Oliver, spending all the time I could with them. But every time they went to Vicky, I felt like they were getting further away from me. She seemed to do everything she could to convince them that life with her would be better. And even though I knew I couldn't let her prevail, there was a growing uneasiness inside me. The boys themselves began to change. Thomas talked more and more about Vicky taking them to new places, buying them expensive things, trying to gain their trust that way. I knew it was manipulation, but how could I explain it to a child who only saw the outside of life? I could only hope that the judge would see the real picture, that my presence in Thomas and Oliver's lives was not just a formality, but a necessity for their well-being. I knew Vicky would struggle too, but my goal was clear. I couldn't let my children become part of her new life in which I was just an outsider. When it came time for the first meeting, I was determined. Vicky looked as confident as ever. Her attorney presented arguments to the judge that she could provide a comfortable life for the children, that she was a mother, and the children needed a mother's care. But my lawyer was prepared for this. He pointed out that I had always been there for the boys, that they needed me as much as they needed their mother. When it came to getting Thomas and Oliver to appear in court, I felt like things could change. I knew the kids didn't want to choose between us, but I also hoped they could convey to the judge that my role in their lives was just as important. It was that moment when I realized that my entire fight depended on their words, and I prayed that they would tell the truth. That day was the hardest day of my life. The trial was still in full swing, and each new encounter in the courtroom left me with a sense of growing anxiety. The whole trial had become an agonizing wait, as if each day was a new stage in a battle on which my entire future and the future of my sons depended. I couldn't escape the feeling that at every hearing, at every word of the lawyers and testimony, my heart clenched tighter and tighter. Vicky looked like she was prepared for this in advance. Her confidence was tearing me apart. Every time her attorney spoke, he emphasized that the mother was a key figure in the children's lives, and that Thomas and Oliver needed her constant presence. But I knew there was a cold reality behind those words. She had long ago chosen a new life for herself, and her plans for the boys and me included her only insofar as it was convenient for her. My lawyer tried to argue the opposite, that I was the figure who had been the one to take care of the children all along. We gave the court the facts, the time I spent with Thomas and Oliver, my involvement in their lives, their education and upbringing. I tried to remain calm, but every time Vicky started talking about her role as a mother, I wanted to jump up and scream that it was a lie. But I realized that the court was looking at facts, not emotions. The closer we got to the moment when the judge was going to make his ruling, the more I felt the nervousness building up. I knew that everything depended not only on what we said in court, but also on what Thomas and Oliver would say. Although I didn't want to put them in this position, I had to accept the brutal truth. Their words would be crucial. When the time came for the questioning of the children, I felt completely devastated. Thomas, only 12 years old, was in a situation that was impossible for him to handle on his own. He was a boy who had to make choices that no child should have to make. Oliver, being too young, didn't realize the seriousness of what was happening. He was just happy to have one of us around him. But Thomas saw and understood everything. He couldn't put it all into words, but his eyes said more than any phrases. As Thomas approached the judge, I could see his hands trembling and his face tense with excitement. He had to answer a question that should never have been asked in his life. "Who do you want to live with?" The judge asked it in a soft voice, trying as much as possible to soften the gravity of the moment. But I could see that for Thomas, it was like being torn in two. "I don't know," Thomas began, his head down. "I love both Dad and Mom. I don't want to choose." The words pierced me like sharp blades. I felt my heart clench with pain. I knew it was too hard for him, and I wanted to go to him, to hug him, to tell him not to make this choice. But I couldn't. I knew this moment was necessary, that the court needed to hear his words. "But if you had to choose?" the judge asked softly, trying to steer the conversation in the right direction. Thomas froze, and for a moment the courtroom fell into absolute silence. His eyes darted around as if he was searching for an answer he couldn't find. I want to be with Dad," he finally breathed out, and I felt a wave of relief and pain wash over me at the same time. I knew it was a hard choice for Thomas, but his words gave me hope. However, I saw Vicky's face tense up. She hadn't expected this answer. Although she continued to keep her mask of calm, her eyes gave it away. This moment was a blow to her, but I knew she wouldn't give up so easily. Oliver, being younger, was unable to give such a clear answer. When asked, all he said was that he wanted to be with his dad and mom, not understanding exactly what was required of him. His words were naive, childish, and it broke my heart even more. He couldn't make that choice, and I didn't want him to make it at all, but the court needed to hear his voice too. After the children's testimony, the judge called a recess, and it was the most agonizing wait of my life. Vicky remained calm, but I knew things were boiling inside her. I tried not to look at her, but I couldn't help but notice how her lawyer seemed to be starting to discuss a new strategy. She wasn't going to back down. When the recess was over, the judge returned, not to announce a decision, but to schedule another hearing. He said the case was too complicated to rule immediately. We were all to return the following week to hear his final verdict. This news was another blow to me. I had hoped that it would end today, that we would finally know what our future would look like. But now I had to endure several more agonizing days of waiting. Vicky didn't show her emotions, but I could see that it came as a surprise to her as well. She had hoped for a quick decision, but the judge had decided otherwise. We both walked out of the courtroom not knowing what would happen next. In the parking lot, I ran into Vicky. She was standing by her car, her face still nonchalant, but I could see that something had changed inside her. She looked at me, and a shadow of doubt flashed across her face for a moment. "Do you really want to do this?" she asked coldly, though her voice was softer than usual. "What do you mean?" I answered, though I knew what she was talking about. "Do you really want to tear everything apart? The kids. They love us both. Why continue this?" I was taken aback by her words. Vicky, who had been fighting for her independence all this time, suddenly asked such a question. But I knew it wasn't a call for reconciliation. She wasn't offering to come back. It was just another of her attempts at manipulation. "I don't want to tear the kids apart," I said, trying to remain calm. "But I won't let you take them away from me." Her face went cold again. She looked at me, as if studying me to see how ready I was to fight. "I'll see you in court," she said, getting into her car and driving away. I was left standing in the parking lot, feeling the emotions raging inside me. Vicky was ready for one last battle, and so was I. As hard as it was, I couldn't let her win. As I drove back home, I thought about what lay ahead of us. I knew that the next few days would be the hardest of my life. Thomas and Oliver sensed that something was wrong, and I had to prepare them for the fact that a decision hadn't been made yet. I knew they expected me to be calm and confident, but I wasn't sure of anything myself. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. Thoughts swirled around in my head, and each new memory of my relationship with Vicky hurt. I knew this divorce was inevitable, but the battle for the children was what I feared the most. Thomas and Oliver were my life, and I couldn't imagine a world where I only saw them on weekends. When the day of the announcement of the court's decision came, I woke up feeling like this moment would decide my entire life. Thomas and Oliver had long sensed the tension surrounding our proceedings. I tried to hide my anxieties from them, but despite my best efforts, they understood more than I would have liked, especially Thomas. His anxiety and reticence over the past few days was further proof to me of how important it was for them to stay with me. I felt that if the court sided with Vicky, the children would be immersed in a world they could not understand or accept. Before court, Oliver, Thomas, and I spent the morning as usual. I tried not to make the day seem like anything special, but deep down, everything was burning with anxiety. Thomas kept his distance, didn't ask too many questions, but I could see that he understood the importance of the day. Oliver, on the other hand, was still too young to realize the seriousness of what was happening. He was playing with his toys, laughing, and didn't realize that this day could change his whole life. As we approached the courthouse, I felt my heart racing. Vicky was already there, standing at the door with a confident look, as if nothing could shake her. Her calmness always annoyed me at times like this, but I knew this wasn't the time to get emotional. Everything had to be decided here and now. The judge finally took his seat, and the room fell into a tense silence. We all waited to see what would happen next. Vicky sat across from me, still unfazed, but I knew that this decision was important to her as well. It wasn't just a fight for her children, it was a step into her new life, one in which she probably expected to use Thomas and Oliver as part of her new reality. The judge began to read the decision slowly, as if trying to give each word extra weight. I strained, listening to his voice, each word sounding like a hammer blow. He noted that the case was complex, that both sides had made compelling arguments. He talked about how important both parents were to the development of children, that children should be able to connect with both. My fingers clenched into fists when he talked about how the boys expressed their desire to spend time with both parents. He emphasized that despite the difficulties in the marriage, the children had the right to see both their mother and father. But then he got to a key point. I knew this moment would decide everything. Who would become the primary caregiver? Who would live with the children most of the time? I held my breath, praying to myself that the judge would rule in my favor. My whole body was tense as a string, and I felt like the entire courtroom was waiting with me. "The children will live with their father," the judge finally said, and I felt a huge weight lifted from my shoulders. My legs weakened for a moment, and I had to lean on the table to keep myself from falling. It was like a lightning strike, and a relief at the same time. Thomas and Oliver would stay with me. The judge explained that the mother would have the right to see the children regularly, but the primary custody and responsibility for their upbringing would fall to me. I looked at Vicky, and I saw something on her face that I hadn't expected: confusion and disappointment. She clearly hadn't expected this outcome. Her confidence with which she had entered this process had finally faltered. This was not what she had prepared for, but I knew it was a fair decision. I couldn't let the kids become part of her new, distant life. After the trial, walking outside, I felt a sense of relief envelop me. It wasn't just the outcome of the trial. It was a victory for my entire family. I knew it was a big moment for Thomas and Oliver as well. Although they didn't fully understand what the court's decision meant, I could see the relief in Thomas's eyes that he was trying to hide. "Is everything going to be okay, Dad?" he asked quietly as we walked to the car. I smiled at him, though inside I was still raging with a mixture of emotions: joy, bitterness, and fatigue from the whole process. "Yes, Thomas, everything's going to be okay now," I said, and for the first time in a long time I felt confident in my words. Oliver was as unconcerned as ever, though I knew that this decision would be important to him as well. Now they would live with me, and we could continue to build our lives together. Of course, there were still many challenges ahead, and I knew that Vicky would not disappear from our lives. She would still be their mother, and I had to accept that they would be spending time with her. A few days passed and life began to return to normal. Thomas and Oliver were smiling more often again, and I could see that they were starting to get used to the new order of things. But at the same time, I realized that this was just the beginning of a new phase. Vicky continued to interact with the children, but she was no longer a part of our daily lives. Her presence had become something temporary, and although it was hard for me to realize it, I knew it was best for all of us. As the weeks passed, I began to notice that Vicky was slowly drifting away from the children. She came to visit them less and less often, finding more and more excuses for her absences. She continued to live her new life, with less and less room for Thomas and Oliver. I didn't want to tell the children about it, but they began to notice her absence themselves. One day, Thomas came up to me as we were sitting on the couch in the evening. "Daddy, doesn't Mommy love us anymore?" he asked quietly, and I heard a note of sadness in his voice that tore at my heart. I looked at him, not knowing how to answer that question. I didn't want to lie to him, but I couldn't tell him the truth either, which was that Vicky had chosen a different life a long time ago. "Thomas, Mom will always love you," I said, trying to speak softly. "It's just that she's going through a difficult time right now. That doesn't mean she's abandoned you." He nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't fully believe what I was saying. Oliver, on the other hand, being younger, hadn't asked such questions yet. For him, the world was still simple and straightforward, and I wanted it to stay that way for as long as possible. Time passed, and our lives slowly took on a new direction. I learned how to be a father who not only takes care of children, but also raises them on my own. It was hard, but I knew it was the best thing for them. Vicky came into our lives less and less often, and although it pained me to see her drifting away from her children, I knew that we now had a chance at a normal, peaceful life. I no longer hoped for her return. I had my family now, Thomas and Oliver. And we began to build our lives anew without Vicky, but with the certainty that everything would be all right.